The sound was deafening, a thunderous roar that echoed off the walls of the lion's den. Sweat beaded on her forehead as Amara stood frozen, her heart hammering like a drum. The lions, their golden eyes glinting in the dim light, prowled closer. She dared not move, dared not breathe. Her pulse raced and fear clawed at her throat. But it wasn't just the lions that terrified her. It was him, standing on the other side of the thick iron bars, smirking. "You shouldn't have come here, Amara," he said, his voice calm yet dripping with malice. The face staring back at her was one she recognized all too well. It wasn't a stranger. It was someone she trusted, someone she worked with. Why? The words screamed in her head, but her voice failed her. How did this happen? How did she end up here? And most importantly, why had he done this to her? His smirk deepened as he slowly walked away, leaving her trapped with the beasts. The sound of his footsteps faded, leaving only the growls of the lions and the thunderous pounding of her heart. Earlier that day, Amara Jackson loved her job. As a tour guide at the city zoo, she spent her days educating visitors about wildlife and conservation. The kids adored her, often calling her Auntie Amara, as they clung to her every word. The animals seemed to like her too. Even the grumpy old lion, Simba, often purred contentedly when she passed by his enclosure. It was a normal Tuesday morning when everything started to unravel. Amara arrived early, her usual sunny disposition lighting up the break room as she greeted her colleagues. Among them was Daniel, the head zookeeper. He was always kind, always helpful. They'd worked together for years, and she considered him a friend. "Morning, Daniel," Amara chirped, setting her bag down. "Morning, Amara," Daniel replied with a tight smile. Something was off. He wasn't his usual self. His eyes didn't meet hers, and he quickly busied himself with paperwork. Amara shrugged it off. Everyone had bad days. She grabbed her schedule for the day and headed out to begin her rounds. The first tour went smoothly. Families oohed and awed as she shared fascinating facts about the animals. The kids squealed with delight when the giraffes stretched their long necks to grab leaves from her hands. Everything seemed perfectly normal. But as the day wore on, strange things started happening. While passing the reptile house, Amara noticed something unusual. The door to the staff-only area was slightly ajar. She peeked inside but saw no one. Strange, she thought. Staff were usually meticulous about security. She decided to mention it to Daniel later. Her next stop was the aviary, where she was scheduled to feed the birds. As she entered, she found the food containers scattered across the floor. Feathers and seed were everywhere. It was as if someone had deliberately made a mess. Who could have done this? Amara muttered to herself, cleaning up as best she could. She couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that something was wrong. During her lunch break, Amara checked her locker and found a note stuffed inside. The handwriting was shaky, almost frantic. "Stay out of the lion's enclosure. Trust no one." Her heart skipped a beat. What kind of sick joke was this? Was someone trying to scare her? She looked around the break room, but no one else seemed to notice her discomfort. She considered telling Daniel, but decided against it. If it was a prank, she didn't want to give the culprit the satisfaction of knowing they'd rattled her. Later that afternoon, Amara crossed paths with Daniel near the elephant exhibit. His face was pale, and his usual calm demeanor was replaced by nervous energy. "Amara, be careful today," he said abruptly. His tone was serious, almost warning. "Why? What's going on?" she asked, her unease growing. He hesitated, glancing around to make sure no one else could hear. "Just trust me, okay? Don't go anywhere near the lion's den." Amara frowned. "Daniel, what's this about? Did something happen?" He didn't answer. Instead, he gave her a look that sent chills down her spine and walked away. Despite the warnings, Amara's sense of duty compelled her to check on Simba and the other lions before ending her shift. She arrived at the enclosure just as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows over the zoo. The area was eerily quiet, too quiet. She entered the staff corridor leading to the lion's den, her footsteps echoing off the concrete walls. As she approached the heavy metal gate separating the lions from the outside world, she noticed it was slightly open. Panic surged through her. The gate was never left open. Something was definitely wrong. Before she could react, a forceful shove from behind sent her stumbling into the enclosure. The gate slammed shut with a loud clang. She turned just in time to see Daniel locking it, a cold, calculated expression on his face. "Daniel," she screamed, banging on the bars. "What are you doing?" But he only smiled that sinister smile and said, "This is where your story ends, Amara." And then he walked away. The lions were getting closer now, their growls reverberating in the pit of her stomach. Amara knew she had to act fast. But how? There was no way out. She was alone, and the one person she thought she could trust had betrayed her in the worst way possible. What was Daniel's motive? Why would he do this to her? As the lions inched closer, Amara's mind raced through every possible escape plan. Would she survive the night, or was this truly the end? Amara's breath came in short gasps as the lions circled her. She knew panicking would only make things worse. She had to think and fast. The enclosure was designed to mimic a natural habitat, with rocky outcrops, tall grasses, and a shallow pool. It was large, but there were no obvious hiding spots that would keep her safe for long. Simba, the dominant male, growled low and deep, his golden eyes never leaving her. Amara had seen him from a safe distance countless times. She'd even fed him on occasion, but now, with no barriers between them, he was terrifying. The other lions followed Simba's lead, their powerful bodies moving with predatory grace. Amara backed up slowly, her hands trembling. She glanced around the enclosure, searching for anything that could help. Then she saw it, a service ladder leading to a maintenance platform near the top of the enclosure wall. It was her only chance. "Steady, Amara. Don't run. Move slowly," she whispered to herself, trying to stay calm. She took a step toward the ladder. Simba's growl intensified. The other lions stopped, their ears flattening against their heads. They were watching her, waiting for the right moment to strike. Amara knew if she made a sudden move, it would trigger their instincts, but staying still wasn't an option either. She had to take a risk. Now or never. She broke into a sprint, heading straight for the ladder. The lions roared in unison, and the chase was on. Amara reached the base of the ladder just as Simba lunged. She felt the rush of air as his massive paws swept inches from her back. Grabbing the rungs, she climbed as fast as she could. Her arms and legs burned with exertion, but adrenaline pushed her forward. She could hear the lions below, their claws scraping against the rocks. Simba jumped, his claws catching the lower rungs of the ladder. The entire structure shook, and Amara screamed, clinging on for dear life. With one final burst of energy, she pulled herself onto the maintenance platform. She collapsed, gasping for air, her body trembling. Below, the lions prowled restlessly, their roars filled with frustration. For a moment, Amara allowed herself to feel a sliver of relief. She was safe, at least for now. But she knew this wasn't over. Daniel had locked her in here, and she had no way of getting out on her own. From her vantage point, Amara could see the zoo's security office in the distance. She hoped someone would notice the commotion and come to her rescue. But as the minutes dragged on, no one came. Her mind raced with questions. Why would Daniel do this? What could he possibly gain from such a cruel act? She thought back to the strange events earlier in the day. The open staff door, the mess in the aviary, the ominous note. It all pointed to a carefully orchestrated plan. But what was the motive? Amara's thoughts were interrupted by the sound of a walkie-talkie crackling to life below. She leaned over the edge of the platform and saw something she hadn't noticed before. Daniel had left his walkie-talkie on a rock near the enclosure's edge. It was risky, but she could get to it. She might be able to call for help. Amara knew she couldn't stay on the platform forever. The lions were relentless, and sooner or later, they'd find a way to reach her. She had to act. She studied the enclosure, trying to map out a path that would keep her as far from the lions as possible. If she could distract them, even for a few seconds, she might have a chance to grab the walkie-talkie. Her eyes landed on a pile of raw meat near the feeding area. It was supposed to be their evening meal, but Daniel had clearly intended for the lions to have a different kind of dinner tonight. Amara tore a piece of fabric from her shirt and tied it around a small rock. She lit the fabric using a lighter she always carried, something she often used to light candles during late-night tours. Holding her makeshift torch, she waved it in the air. "Come on, you big cats," she shouted, her voice shaking but defiant. "You want a piece of me? Come and get it." The lions snarled, their attention drawn to the flickering flame. Amara threw the torch toward the pile of meat. The fabric caught fire, and smoke began to rise. For a moment, the lions hesitated, their instincts battling between fear of the fire and hunger for the meat. It was the opening Amara needed. She scrambled down the ladder, her movements quick but careful. The lions were distracted, but she knew it wouldn't last long. Reaching the ground, she sprinted toward the walkie-talkie. Her fingers closed around it, just as Simba let out a ferocious roar. The fire had burned out, and the lions were once again focused on her. Amara fumbled with the walkie-talkie, pressing the button. "This is Amara Jackson. I'm trapped in the lion's den. Someone, please help." There was static, followed by a familiar voice. "Amara, is that you? What's going on?" It was Zoe, one of the security guards. Relief washed over Amara. "Zoe, it's Daniel. He locked me in here. Get help," Amara cried, her voice desperate. Before Zoe could respond, the walkie-talkie was snatched from Amara's hand. She looked up, her blood running cold. Daniel stood there, his face twisted with rage. "You just don't know when to quit, do you?" he snarled. Daniel raised the walkie-talkie to his lips and spoke calmly. "False alarm, Zoe? Everything's under control here." Amara's heart sank. He had complete control of the situation, and he wasn't going to let her leave easily. "Why, Daniel?" she demanded, her voice trembling. "Why are you doing this?" Daniel sneered. "You wouldn't understand, Amara. Some things are bigger than you or me. You just had to stick your nose where it didn't belong." Before she could respond, he grabbed her arm, dragging her back toward the center of the enclosure. The lions watched with keen interest, sensing the tension. Amara struggled, but Daniel was strong. "You'll pay for this, Daniel," she spat, her fear giving way to anger. Daniel leaned in close, his voice a chilling whisper. "We'll see who pays, Amara. This is only the beginning." With that, he shoved her toward the lions once more. Amara stumbled, barely catching herself before falling. The lions began to close in again, their growls rumbling like distant thunder. Daniel stood by the gate, his hand on the lock. "Let's see how well you can survive on your own," he said, his voice cold. The last thing Amara saw before the gate slammed shut was Daniel's smug face disappearing into the shadows. The lions roared, and Amara braced herself for the fight of her life. Amara's eyes darted between the lions and the locked gate. The reality of her predicament was sinking in, but she refused to give in to despair. She clenched her fists, her mind racing. She had escaped death once today, and she wasn't about to let Daniel win. Simba growled low, his body tense as he prepared to pounce. Amara's heart pounded, but she noticed something unusual. The lions weren't attacking. They were circling her, watching her closely, as if waiting for something. What are they waiting for? She wondered, her fear mingling with confusion. She edged backward, keeping her eyes on the lions. She remembered how calm Simba usually was around her during feeding times. He wasn't acting like a typical predator. It was almost as if he recognized her. A risky idea began to form in her mind. "Simba," she whispered, her voice trembling but steady. "It's me, Amara. You know me, don't you?" The lion tilted his head, his golden eyes narrowing. He let out a soft chuffing sound, a sound Amara had heard before when he was content. The other lions paused, their aggression momentarily subdued. Amara took a deep breath and slowly crouched down, lowering herself to the lion's level. She extended her hand cautiously, keeping her movements slow and deliberate. Her heart was pounding so loudly she was sure they could hear it. "Please, Simba," she murmured, "I need your help." The lion took a tentative step forward, his massive paws silent on the dirt. Amara fought the urge to flinch as Simba's face came within inches of hers. He stiffed her hand, his warm breath washing over her skin. For a moment, everything was still. Then, to her astonishment, Simba nuzzled her hand, his rough mane brushing against her fingers. Amara let out a shaky laugh, tears welling up in her eyes. "Good boy," she said softly, her voice filled with relief. The other lions seemed to relax, their tense postures softening. Amara knew she couldn't let her guard down completely, but for now, she had a sliver of hope. With Simba's trust secured, Amara felt a renewed sense of determination. She needed to find a way out of the enclosure and fast. She scanned the area, her eyes landing on the maintenance platform she had climbed earlier. If she could get back up there, she might be able to find another way to signal for help. She glanced at Simba, who was now sitting calmly beside her. "Think you can keep your friends calm while I figure out a way out of here?" she asked, half joking. The lion chuffed again, as if in response. Amara stood slowly, keeping one hand on Simba for reassurance. She made her way toward the base of the platform, her mind racing. But before she could climb, a chilling sound stopped her in her tracks. It was the unmistakable crackle of the walkie-talkie. Daniel's voice echoed through the enclosure. "Enjoying your time with the lions, Amara," he taunted. "I hope you're making peace with your fate." Amara's blood boiled. "You won't get away with this, Daniel," she shouted. Daniel's laugh was cold and mocking. "Oh, I already have. By the time they find you, it'll be too late, and no one will ever know the truth." Amara gritted her teeth, refusing to let Daniel's words shake her. She needed to outsmart him, but first she had to understand his motive. Why would he go to such lengths to harm her? As she pondered, a memory surfaced, something she had overheard in the staff lounge weeks ago. Daniel had been arguing with the zoo's director about budget cuts and funding reallocations. He had been particularly upset about Amara's wildlife education program, which had recently received additional funding at the expense of the zookeeping department. Could this be about money? Amara wondered. But even if Daniel was bitter about losing funding, trapping her in a lion's den seemed like a drastic response. There had to be more to the story. Determined to find answers, Amara decided to search the enclosure for anything unusual. If Daniel had planned this, he might have left behind clues. She moved carefully, staying close to Simba, who seemed to sense her unease. Near the far end of the enclosure, partially hidden beneath some rocks, Amara spotted something metallic gleaming in the moonlight. She crouched down and uncovered it, a small black device with a blinking red light. Her stomach dropped. A camera. Daniel was recording everything. Suddenly, it all made sense. He wasn't just trying to kill her. He was framing her. If she didn't make it out alive, the footage could be manipulated to make it look like she had entered the lion's den recklessly, leading to her tragic death. Amara clenched her fists, anger surging through her. "You won't win, Daniel," she vowed. Before she could decide what to do next, the sound of footsteps echoed from the staff corridor. Amara's heart leaped. Was it help? But as the figure emerged from the shadows, her hope turned to horror. It wasn't a security guard. It was Daniel, and he wasn't alone. Beside him stood a tall man in a dark suit, his face partially obscured by a hat. His presence exuded authority and danger. "Meet my business partner," Daniel said, his voice dripping with smugness. "He's here to make sure everything goes according to plan." The man stepped forward, his cold eyes locking onto Amara. "You've been a problem for us, Miss Jackson," he said, his voice low and menacing. But not for much longer. Amara's mind raced. Who was this man, and what kind of scheme had she stumbled into? Before she could ask, the man pulled out a remote and pressed a button. The gate to the enclosure began to open, and the lions tensed, their instincts kicking back in. Amara's blood ran cold as Daniel smirked. "Let's see how you handle the real king of the jungle." The lions weren't the only danger now. A larger, more terrifying predator was being released into the enclosure, a tiger. Amara backed up, her eyes darting between the lions and the approaching tiger. She could feel the tension in the air as the two apex predators sized each other up. The tiger let out a bone-chilling roar, and Amara knew the fragile peace she had maintained with the lions was about to shatter. Trapped between two deadly forces, Amara braced herself for the ultimate fight for survival. The tiger's roar echoed through the enclosure, sending a wave of dread through Amara. Its massive form emerged fully into the dim light, muscles rippling beneath its striped coat. The lions tensed, their golden eyes locked onto the new intruder. The fragile balance of the predator hierarchy was about to collapse. Amara's mind raced. She was now caught between two deadly forces, each more terrifying than the other. Simba growled low, his body lowering into a defensive stance. The lionesses flanked him, forming a united front. The tiger, undeterred, bared its teeth and began to circle. This can't be happening, Amara thought. She was in the middle of a standoff that could turn deadly in an instant. She had to act fast. But how? Amara's eyes darted around the enclosure, searching for anything she could use to buy time. Her gaze landed on the pile of meat from earlier. It wasn't much, but it could serve as a distraction. Moving carefully, she inched toward the feeding area. The lions and tiger were too focused on each other to notice her. When she reached the pile, she grabbed the largest chunk of meat and hurled it as far as she could. The sound of the meat hitting the ground drew the tiger's attention. It paused, sniffing the air, its eyes flicking toward the source of the sound. The lions, too, seemed momentarily distracted. Amara took the opportunity to climb back onto the maintenance platform, her muscles burning with exertion. From her elevated position, she could see the standoff below more clearly. The tiger, deciding the meat wasn't worth the fight, refocused on the lions. It let out another roar, and the lions responded in kind. This is going to get ugly, Amara thought, her heart pounding. From her vantage point, Amara could see Daniel and his mysterious accomplice watching from the shadows. They seemed to be enjoying the chaos they had orchestrated. Amara's anger flared. She wasn't just fighting for her life. She was fighting to expose their cruelty. She remembered the camera she had found earlier. If she could get that footage, it might be her only chance to prove Daniel's treachery. But first, she needed to survive. The tension in the enclosure snapped as the tiger lunged at Simba. The two massive predators collided with a force that shook the ground. The lionesses sprang into action, flanking the tiger and trying to drive it back. Claws slashed and roars filled the air as the battle raged. Amara watched in horror, knowing that if the fight escalated, it could end in bloodshed, not just for the animals, but for her as well. She had to find a way to stop it. A sudden idea struck her. If she could create a loud enough noise, it might startle the animals and break their focus. She spotted a metal pipe lying near the base of the platform. It was within reach, but she would have to climb down to get it. It's a risk, but I have no choice, she thought. Amara climbed down as quickly and quietly as she could. She reached the ground and grabbed the pipe, then clambered back up to the platform. Once she was safe, she raised the pipe and slammed it against the metal railing. The loud, ringing clang reverberated through the enclosure, cutting through the sounds of the fight. The lions and tiger froze, their heads snapping toward the source of the noise. Amara banged the pipe again. "Back off," she shouted, her voice shaking but determined. "Leave each other alone." To her surprise, the distraction worked. The animals backed away from each other, their growls subsiding into worry huffs. For a moment, the tension eased. But Amara's relief was short-lived. From the shadows, Daniel's voice rang out, cold and mocking. "Clever, Amara, but you can't keep this up forever." He stepped forward, his accomplice close behind. The man in the dark suit held a remote in his hand, his finger hovering over a button. "Let's make things more interesting," the man said, his voice devoid of emotion. Before Amara could react, he pressed the button. A loud clicking sound echoed through the enclosure, and the gate to a second holding area began to rise. Amara's heart sank as a new threat emerged, a pair of hyenas, their sinister laughs echoing in the night. They were smaller than the lions and tiger, but no less dangerous. Their pack mentality and cunning made them formidable predators. Daniel smirked. "Let's see how you handle this." Amara's breath caught in her throat as the hyenas slinked into the enclosure, their eyes gleaming with malevolent intelligence. The lions and tiger turned their attention to the new arrivals, their growls rumbling low and threatening. Amara knew the fragile truce she had created wouldn't last. The enclosure was now a ticking time bomb, and she was running out of options. The hyenas moved with eerie precision, their cackles filling the enclosure like a twisted symphony. They didn't attack right away. Instead, they circled the lions and tiger, their movements calculated and deliberate. They were testing the waters, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Amara gripped the metal pipe tightly, her knuckles white. From her perch on the maintenance platform, she had a clear view of the unfolding chaos. The lions, already weary from their clash with the tiger, now faced a new threat. The tiger, still tense, eyed the hyenas with a mix of disdain and readiness. Amara's mind raced. She needed to act before the situation spiraled further out of control. But what could she do against this deadly mix of predators? "Simba," she called softly, her voice trembling. The lion's ears twitched at the sound of her voice, and he glanced up at her. "You gotta trust me. I'll get us out of this." She didn't know if he understood her words, but she hoped he could sense her determination. Simba let out a low chuff, a sound that gave Amara a spark of hope. Amara turned her attention to the tiger. "And you," she murmured. "We're all in this together, whether you like it or not." The tiger's gaze shifted toward her, its eyes narrowing as if weighing her intentions. It didn't growl, which Amara took as a good sign. The hyenas, however, were growing bolder. One of them darted forward, snapping at a lioness before retreating with a sinister laugh. The lioness growled, but she didn't give chase. The lions were conserving their energy, knowing a full-on attack would be disastrous. Amara had to think fast. What would stop a pack of hyenas? An idea struck her: fire. Animals instinctively feared it, and it might be enough to drive the hyenas back. But she needed something more substantial than a makeshift torch. She scanned the platform and spotted a bundle of dry hay near the feeding area below. If she could light it, the resulting flames and smoke might create enough of a barrier to keep the predators apart. Amara rummaged through her pockets, her fingers closing around her lighter. She quickly tore off another piece of her shirt, wrapping it around the pipe. She lit the fabric, creating a makeshift torch. "Okay, here goes nothing," she whispered. She climbed down cautiously, her eyes never leaving the animals. The lions and tiger were still holding their ground, but the hyenas were closing in. Amara sprinted toward the hay, her torch held high. She reached the pile and thrust the torch into it. The dry hay caught quickly, flames leaping up and casting an orange glow across the enclosure. Smoke billowed into the air, and the hyenas immediately backed off, their laughter turning to uneasy whines. The lions and tiger retreated a few steps, worried but less panicked. Amara's plan was working, for now. From the shadows, Daniel's voice rang out, filled with anger. "You're more resourceful than I gave you credit for, Amara, but you're only delaying the inevitable." He stepped forward, his accomplice close behind. The man in the dark suit didn't seem fazed by the turn of events. Instead, he pulled out a second remote, his expression cold and calculating. "This ends now," the man said, his finger hovering over the button. Amara's stomach tightened. What now? Before the man could press the button, a sudden commotion erupted near the staff corridor. Shouts echoed through the air, followed by the sound of running footsteps. "Security!" a voice yelled. "Amara, are you in there?" It was Zoe, the security guard. Relief flooded Amara's chest. Daniel cursed under his breath. "You couldn't just stay out of this, could you?" he muttered. His accomplice scowled. "We need to leave. Now." But Daniel hesitated, his eyes flicking back to the enclosure. He wasn't done yet. Amara seized the moment. "Zoe, over here," she shouted, waving her arms to get the guard's attention. Zoe and two other security personnel appeared at the edge of the enclosure, their flashlights cutting through the darkness. They took in the scene, the smoldering fire, the circling predators, and Amara perched near the maintenance platform. "Hang on, we're getting you out," Zoe called, pulling out a radio to call for backup. But Daniel wasn't about to let Amara escape so easily. With a snarl, he grabbed the remote from his accomplice and pressed the button. The fire suppression system in the enclosure activated, dousing the flames and sending jets of water spraying in all directions. The sudden chaos startled the animals, and they scattered in different directions. Amara barely had time to react before Daniel pulled another lever, causing the platform she was standing on to shake violently. The structure groaned under the strain, and Amara's balance faltered. She grabbed onto the railing, her heart pounding. "Hold on," To shouted, running toward the control panel to override Daniel's sabotage. But Daniel wasn't done. He lunged toward the gate, trying to lock it again before security could intervene. His accomplice, meanwhile, melted into the shadows, disappearing from view. Just as Amara thought things couldn't get worse, the weakened platform gave a final shudder and collapsed beneath her. She fell, her scream echoing through the enclosure as the ground rushed up to meet her. The last thing she saw before impact was Simba, his golden eyes filled with alarm. Amara hit the ground hard, her body jolting with pain as she landed on the dirt floor of the enclosure. Her vision blurred, and for a moment, all she could hear was the dull ringing in her ears. She gasped for air, her chest tight from the impact. When her vision cleared, she realized she wasn't alone. The lions and tiger had regrouped, their predatory eyes now fixed on her once again. The hyenas circled at a distance, their sinister laughter echoing in the night. Amara tried to push herself up, but a sharp pain shot through her leg. "It's probably sprained," she thought grimly, wincing as she shifted her weight. Her survival instincts kicked in. She couldn't afford to stay down. Not here. Not now. Simba stepped forward, his massive form towering over her. Amara's heart raced, but she forced herself to stay calm. She met his gaze, hoping he would remember the trust they had built moments earlier. "Simba," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Help me." The lion paused, his golden eyes studying her intently. Then, to her relief, he did something unexpected. He turned his back to her and faced the other predators. With a powerful roar, he asserted his dominance, signaling that Amara was under his protection. The lionesses followed suit, flanking Simba and creating a protective barrier around her. The tiger growled but didn't advance. The hyenas, sensing the shift in power, hesitated, their cackles turning into nervous whines. Amara felt a surge of hope. For now, the lions were on her side. But the danger wasn't over. Daniel was still outside the enclosure, frantically working the controls. He was desperate to regain control of the situation. "Zoe, he's trying to lock us in," Amara shouted, her voice hoarse but urgent. Zoe was already on it. She sprinted toward the control panel, tackling Daniel before he could secure the gate. The two struggled, and for a moment, it looked like Zoe had the upper hand. But Daniel was cunning. He pulled a hidden knife from his belt, forcing Zoe to back off. "You think you can stop me?" he sneered, his eyes wild with rage. Zoe didn't flinch. "You're done, Daniel. Backup is on the way." Daniel glanced around, realizing his time was running out. His accomplice had vanished, leaving him to face the consequences alone. But Daniel wasn't ready to give up. He grabbed the second remote, the one controlling the electric barriers. "You want to play hero, Amara," he shouted. "Let's see how you handle this." He pressed the button, and a low hum filled the air as the electric barriers reactivated. Sparks danced along the enclosure's perimeter, cutting off any chance of escape. Amara's mind raced. The electrified barriers meant she couldn't climb out, and with her injured leg, running was out of the question. She needed another way to outsmart Daniel, and fast. She noticed the maintenance ladder she had used earlier was still intact, albeit shaky. If she could reach it, she might be able to climb to safety. But first, she needed to distract Daniel and buy herself some time. "Zoe," she called, "I need a diversion." Zoe understood immediately. She grabbed a handful of rocks and began pelting them at Daniel, forcing him to duck and shield himself. "Hey, coward, why don't you come down here and face us like a man?" she taunted. Daniel growled in frustration, his attention momentarily diverted. Amara seized the opportunity. She limped toward the ladder, every step sending jolts of pain through her leg. Simba and the lionesses stayed close, their protective presence keeping the other predators at bay. She reached the ladder and began to climb, her hands trembling with effort. The rickety structure groaned under her weight, but she didn't stop. She had to reach the top. Just as she neared the platform, a sudden jolt of electricity surged through the enclosure. The ladder vibrated violently, and Amara lost her grip. She slipped, dangling by one hand as the sparks danced dangerously close. "Hold on, Amara," Zoe shouted, her voice filled with urgency. But Daniel wasn't done. He aimed the remote at the ladder, determined to shake her off. "You're not getting out of this alive," he snarled. Before he could press the button again, a powerful roar erupted from below. Simba lunged toward the gate, his massive paws striking the metal bars with a force that rattled the entire structure. The impact startled Daniel, causing him to drop the remote. It clattered to the ground, just out of reach. So didn't waste a second. She kicked the remote away, then tackled Daniel to the ground, pinning him with surprising strength. "You're done, Daniel," she spat, slapping cuffs onto his wrists as the sound of approaching sirens filled the air. With Daniel subdued, Amara summoned her remaining strength and pulled herself back onto the platform. She collapsed, gasping for air, her body shaking from exhaustion and pain. Below, the lions gathered near the gate, their watchful eyes still on her. Simba let out a low, reassuring chuff, as if to say, "You're safe now." Amara managed a weak smile. "Thank you," she whispered. The security team arrived moments later, flooding the area with light. They quickly deactivated the electric barriers and opened the gate. A stretcher was brought in, and Amara was carefully lifted to safety. As she was wheeled out of the enclosure, she locked eyes with Daniel one last time. His smug expression was gone, replaced by a look of pure defeat. "You'll pay for this," he muttered under his breath. Amara didn't flinch. "No, Daniel, you will." As the ambulance doors closed, Amara couldn't shake the feeling that this was far from over. Daniel may have been caught, but his accomplice was still out there, and the mystery behind their scheme remained unsolved. Amara lay on the hospital bed, her leg wrapped in a tight bandage. The room was quiet except for the steady beep of the heart monitor. The events of the past night replayed in her mind, each moment etched vividly into her memory. The fall, the roar of the tiger, Daniel's chilling smirk, and the lion's surprising protection. But one question loomed larger than the rest. Who was Daniel's accomplice, and what were they really after? The door creaked open, pulling Amara from her thoughts. Zoe entered, her face etched with concern. "How are you holding up?" Zoe asked, pulling up a chair. "Alive?" Amara replied, managing a weak smile. "Thanks to you." Zoe shook her head. "You were the real hero out there." "But Amara, this thing with Daniel, it's bigger than we thought." Amara's pulse quickened. "What do you mean?" Zoe pulled out a folder and placed it on the bedside table. While they were processing Daniel, they found something on him: documents, encrypted files, and a list of names. Amara's brow furrowed. Names of who? Zoo staff, board members, even a few prominent figures in the city. "It looks like Daniel was part of a larger operation," Zoe explained, "and we still don't know the identity of his partner." Amara's mind raced. The man in the dark suit, his cold, calculating demeanor. He wasn't just a partner, he was the mastermind. Later that evening, as Amara drifted in and out of sleep, she heard a soft knock on her door. Before she could respond, the door opened, and a man in a suit stepped inside. He wasn't a doctor or a nurse. He was too polished, too deliberate in his movements. "Ms. Jackson," he said, his voice smooth. "I'm Detective Harris. I'm leading the investigation into Daniel's case." Amara's eyes narrowed. She didn't trust anyone in a suit, not after what had happened. "What do you want?" "I've come to update you on our progress," Harris said, pulling out a small notebook. "We've identified Daniel's accomplice. His name is Vincent Kane, a known operative for a covered organization involved in illegal animal trafficking and smuggling." Amara's stomach turned. Animal trafficking? Harris nodded. They target zoos, using them as fronts to smuggle exotic animals out of the country. Your education program was a threat to their operation, so they needed you out of the way. Amara clenched her fists. They tried to kill me to protect their operation. Yes, Harris said, his tone serious. But there's more. We believe Kane has fled the city. He's dangerous and well-connected. We need your help to bring him down. Amara hesitated. She was just a zoo tour guide, not a detective. But the thought of those animals being exploited fueled her resolve. "What do you need me to do?" she asked. Over the next few days, Amara worked closely with Harris and his team. They combed through the encrypted files found on Daniel, uncovering a network of smuggling routes, fake permits, and offshore accounts. The deeper they dug, the more dangerous it became. Kane was always one step ahead, leaving behind a trail of false leads and dead ends. But Amara was determined. She used her knowledge of the zoo's operations to help the team predict Kane's next move. One night, while reviewing surveillance footage from the zoo, Amara spotted something. A man in a dark suit, his face partially obscured, moving near the lion's enclosure. It was Kane. "There," she said, pointing at the screen. "That's him." Harris leaned in, his expression grim. "Looks like he was scouting the area before the attack. We need to act fast." Harris devised a plan to lure Kane out of hiding. They spread false information through their channels, making it seem like the zoo was hosting a rare animal auction. It was risky, but it was their best shot. Amara insisted on being part of the operation. "I know the zoo better than anyone," she argued. "If Kane shows up, I'll spot him." Reluctantly, Harris agreed. On the night of the operation, the zoo was heavily guarded. Amara waited in the shadows, her heart pounding. Every sound, every shadow made her jump. Hours passed with no sign of Kane. Amara began to worry that the plan had failed. But then she saw him, a tall figure in a dark suit, moving toward the reptile house. Amara signaled to Harris. "It's him." Harris and his team moved in, surrounding the building. But Kane wasn't alone. Two armed men emerged from the shadows, covering his escape. Gunfire erupted, shattering the tense silence. Amara ducked behind a crate, her heart racing. The sound of footsteps and shouts filled the air as the standoff unfolded. Amara felt a hand grab her shoulder, and she spun around, ready to defend herself. But it wasn't Harris or one of his team. It was Kane. His cold eyes locked onto hers as he pressed a gun to her side. "You've been a thorn in my side for too long, Miss Jackson," he said, his voice icy. "Time to end this." Amara's breath caught as Kane began dragging her toward the exit. Amara's mind raced as Kane's grip tightened around her arm, his cold presence sending chills down her spine. He dragged her through the dimly lit corridors of the reptile house, his gun pressed firmly against her side. The distant sounds of gunfire and shouting echoed through the zoo, but here, the quiet shadows, it felt like they were alone. "You've been quite the nuisance, Amara," Kane muttered, his voice calm but laced with menace. "Daniel was a fool, but you're persistent. I'll give you that." Amara's heart pounded, but she refused to show fear. "Why are you doing this?" she demanded, her voice steadier than she felt. "Why kill innocent animals? Why destroy lives?" Kane chuckled darkly. "You think this is about money or power. It's much bigger than that. You wouldn't understand." "Try me," Amara shot back, hoping to buy time. Kane smirked. "Let's just say there's a high demand for what we offer, and people like you, with your bleeding hearts and righteous crusades, get in the way." As they approached the back exit of the reptile house, Amara spotted something, an emergency alarm lever mounted on the wall. If she could reach it, she might have a chance to alert Harris and his team. They stopped near the door, and Kane pulled out a small device from his pocket. "This will ensure we're not followed," he said, pressing a button. A soft beep sounded, and Amara realized with horror that he had activated the bomb. "You're insane," she gasped. Kane's smirk widened. "No, just efficient." He began leading her toward the exit, but Amara knew she couldn't let him leave with her. If she was going down, she wasn't going down quietly. In a swift motion, she stomped on Kane's foot with all her strength, causing him to loosen his grip. Simultaneously, she lunged for the emergency alarm and pulled it down. A deafening siren blared, flooding the building with red flashing lights. Kane cursed, his composure slipping for the first time. "You little." he growled, raising his gun. But before he could fire, Harris and his team burst through the door, their weapons drawn. "Freeze! Drop the weapon," Harris shouted. Kane hesitated for a split second, then grabbed Amara, using her as a human shield. "Stay back, or she dies," he barked. Amara could feel the tension in the air, the room thick with danger. Harris' eyes locked onto hers, silently communicating a plan. Amara knew she had to play her part. "Let her go, Kane," Harris said calmly, inching closer. "There's no way out of this." Kane's eyes darted around the room, searching for an escape. "You underestimate me, detective," he sneered. But Amara wasn't going to let him control the situation. Summoning all her courage, she slammed her elbow into Kane's ribs, causing him to stumble. In the same moment, Harris fired, his shot hitting Kane's arm and forcing him to drop the gun. Amara broke free, diving to the ground as Harris's team subdued Kane. The other two armed men were quickly overpowered, their weapons confiscated. The bomb timer, however, was still ticking. "Bomb!" Amara shouted, pointing to the blinking device on the wall. Harris immediately called for the bomb squad, but they were minutes away, and the timer was rapidly counting down. "Can you disarm it?" Zoe asked, her voice urgent. Amara stared at the device, her mind flashing back to a safety training session she had attended years ago. She wasn't an expert, but she knew enough to recognize the basic components of a timer. "I think I can try," she said, her hands trembling. Harris handed her a pair of wire cutters. "You got less than 2 minutes. Can you do it?" Amara swallowed hard. "I'll do my best." She knelt in front of the bomb, her heart pounding as she examined the wires. Red, blue, yellow, and green. One wrong move, and it was over. "Cut the red wire last," she muttered to herself, recalling the training. "Blue first, then yellow." She took a deep breath and made the first cut. The timer continued to count down, but nothing exploded. Encouraged, she cut the yellow wire next. 30 seconds, Harris warned, his voice tense. Amara's hands were slick with sweat as she reached for the green wire. She hesitated for a split second, then made the cut. The timer stopped at 3 seconds. The room was silent except for the sound of everyone's breathing. Amara slumped back, her body shaking with relief. "You did it," Zoe said, helping her up. Amara managed a weak smile. That was way too close. As Harris's team escorted Kane and his men out in handcuffs, Kane turned to Amara one last time. "This isn't over, Miss Jackson," he said, his voice low and chilling. "You've only scratched the surface." Amara felt a shiver run down her spine. She knew Kane wasn't bluffing. There were more players in this deadly game, and she had just become their prime target. As the police cars drove away and the sirens faded into the distance, Amara stood in the aftermath of the chaos, her mind racing with questions. What exactly was the extent of Kane's operation? Who else was involved? And how far would they go to protect their secrets? She had survived the night, but the battle was far from over. Somewhere in the city, someone was already planning their next move. The city's skyline glowed faintly under the early morning sky as Amara stood by her apartment window, clutching a steaming cup of tea. Sleep had eluded her. The events of the last few days replayed relentlessly in her mind. The lion's roars, the tension of disarming the bomb, Kane's chilling words. "You've only scratched the surface." What did he mean? And how deep did this conspiracy go? Her phone buzzed on the table, snapping her out of her thoughts. It was Zoe. "Amara," Zoe's voice was urgent. "You need to see this. Turn on the news." Amara grabbed the remote and switched on the TV. The headline on the screen made her blood run cold. "Zoo scandal. New evidence links wildlife trafficking to prominent officials." The news anchor's voice filled the room. "Breaking news this morning as leaked documents reveal connections between the recently arrested Vincent Kane and several high-ranking city officials. These individuals are alleged to have facilitated illegal wildlife trafficking operations in exchange for substantial bribes." Amara sank into her chair, her mind racing. Prominent officials? If this went all the way to the top, the danger was far from over. Her phone buzzed again. This time, it was Detective Harris. "We need to talk," he said, his tone grave. "Can you meet me at the station?" Amara nodded, even though he couldn't see her. "I'll be there." At the station, Harris wasted no time. He led Amara to a private briefing room, where Zoe and a few other officers were waiting. A large board covered in photographs, documents, and maps dominated the room. At the center was a photo of Vincent Kane with red lines connecting him to various individuals and locations. "This," Harris said, pointing to the board, is what we've uncovered so far. Kane wasn't lying when he said you've only scratched the surface. His organization, which we're calling the Shadow Network, spans multiple cities and countries. Amara's eyes scanned the board. And these officials? They're all part of it. Harris nodded. Yes, they've been using their power to protect the trafficking ring and silence anyone who gets too close. Amara felt a mix of anger and determination. And now they'll come after me. That's why we're here, Harris said. We're working to protect you and gather enough evidence to bring the entire network down. Zoe stepped forward. We believe Kane's arrest has triggered a response. His associates won't stay quiet for long. Amara took a deep breath. What's the plan? Harris outlined a strategy to draw out more members of the Shadow Network. They would use Amara as bait, setting up a fake meeting where she would supposedly hand over crucial evidence. The location would be monitored by law enforcement, ready to catch anyone who showed up. It's risky, Harris admitted, but it's our best chance to expose more of the network. Amara agreed, though the thought of putting herself in danger again made her stomach churn. She knew the stakes were high, not just for her, but for the countless animals whose lives were being exploited. The meeting was scheduled for the following night, at an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of the city. Harris and his team would be stationed nearby, ready to move in at the first sign of trouble. As night fell, Amara sat alone in the dimly lit warehouse, her heart pounding. A small recording device was hidden in her jacket, transmitting everything to Harris and his team. The minutes dragged on, each second stretching into an eternity. Finally, the sound of footsteps echoed through the warehouse. Amara tensed, her hand instinctively moving toward the panic button Harris had given her. A shadowy figure emerged from the darkness. It wasn't Kane. He was still in custody. This was someone new. A tall woman with sharp features and piercing eyes. You must be Amara, the woman said, her voice smooth but cold. I've heard a lot about you. Amara forced herself to stay calm. And you are. The woman smiled. Call me Eva. I'm here to make you an offer. Amara raised an eyebrow. An offer? Eva nodded, her expression unreadable. Hand over the evidence you claim to have, and we'll make sure you disappear quietly. No harm, no fuss. Amara's blood boiled. And if I refuse? Eva's smile widened, but it didn't reach her eyes. Then to find out just how far the Shadow Network is willing to go to protect its interests. Before Amara could respond, the warehouse doors burst open, and Harris's team stormed in, weapons drawn. Freeze, hands in the air, Harris shouted. Eva didn't flinch. Instead, she calmly raised her hands, her eyes still locked on Amara. You think this ends with me? She said, her tone almost amused. You've already lost. As the officers cuffed Eva and led her away, Amara felt a brief sense of relief, but that relief was shattered when she heard a familiar voice from behind her. Drop your weapon, Harris, said one of his own officers, turning a gun on him. Amara's heart sank. A mole. The tension in the room skyrocketed as Harris slowly raised his hands, his face a mix of shock and fury. You gotta be kidding me, he muttered. The mole smirked. Sorry, detective, but loyalty only goes so far. Amara's pulse raced as she realized the true danger they were in. The Shadow Network wasn't just outside the law. It had infiltrated their very ranks. The mole's gun remained steady as he gestured for Amara to move. You're coming with me, he said, and this time there won't be any last-minute rescues. Amara stood frozen, her breath caught in her throat. The mole's gun gleamed in the faint light of the warehouse, its barrel aimed squarely at her. The betrayal cut deeper than fear. One of Harris' own men, someone they had trusted, was working for the Shadow Network. Don't do this, Harris said, his voice steady but edged with tension. It's not too late to make this right. The mole sneered. You don't get it, do you? You can't win. The network has eyes everywhere. You think taking down Kane or Eva means anything? They're just pieces on a board, replaceable. Amara's mind raced. She glanced at Harris, whose subtle nod told her he was still calculating their next move. The other officers stood frozen, their weapons lowered but tense, waiting for an opening. Let's go, Amara, the mole said, his voice firm. We're leaving. Amara took a slow step forward, her hands raised. Every nerve in her body screamed at her to run, but she knew that would only end badly. She needed to stall to find a way to shift the power balance. You're making a mistake, she said, her voice calm despite the fear bubbling inside her. The Shadow Network doesn't care about you. When you're no longer useful, they'll toss you aside like the others. The mole's jaw tightened. Save your breath. I know exactly what I signed up for. Harris saw his chance, "But do you know what she has?" he said, his tone baiting. "The evidence you're after. It's not just recordings or names. It's a direct link to the network's financials. Offshore accounts, shell companies, everything they've tried to bury." The mole faltered for a split second, his eyes flicking to Amara. Harris pressed on. "Do you really think they'll let you live once you've delivered it? You know too much. You're a liability." Amara saw doubt flash across the mole's face. It was fleeting, but it was enough. "Shut up," the mole barked, his grip on the gun tightening. But his stance shifted ever so slightly, giving Harris the opening he needed. In one swift motion, Harris lunged forward, grabbing the barrel of the gun and twisting it away. The weapon discharged, the deafening shot ringing out as the bullet embedded in a nearby wall. Amara ducked, her heart racing as chaos erupted. The other officers sprang into action, subduing the mole with practiced precision. Within seconds, the mole was disarmed and cuffed, his face twisted in rage. "You'll regret this," he spat, glaring at Harris. "The network will come for you all." Harris didn't flinch. Let them try. With the immediate threat neutralized, Harris turned his attention back to Amara. "Are you okay?" he asked, his concern genuine. Amara nodded, though her hands still trembled. "I'm fine. But he's right, isn't he? This isn't over." Harris sighed, running a hand through his hair. "No, it's not. But we made progress. With Eva and the mole in custody, we're one step closer to dismantling their operation." Amara's gaze shifted to Eva, who sat calmly in the back of a police van, her sharp eyes observing everything. She didn't look defeated. If anything, she seemed amused. As if sensing Amara's thoughts, Eva leaned forward, her voice cutting through the tension. "You think you've won tonight," she said, her tone almost playful. "But the network doesn't crumble that easily. You've only delayed the inevitable." Amara narrowed her eyes. "Why don't you tell us what the inevitable is, then?" Eva's smile widened. "You'll find out soon enough, and when you do, you'll wish you hadn't meddled." Harris slammed the van doors shut, cutting off any further taunts. "Take her away," he ordered. As the police vehicles pulled away, Amara felt a heavy weight settle on her shoulders. The fight wasn't just about exposing corruption or saving animals anymore. It was about survival. The Shadow Network wouldn't stop until they silenced everyone who threatened their empire. "Harris," she said quietly, "we need to go deeper. If they're this connected, they won't just rely on people like Kane or Eva. There's a bigger structure we haven't seen yet." Harris nodded. "Agreed. But that means stepping into dangerous territory. They'll come after you harder now." Amara took a deep breath. "Then we make sure we're ready." Back at the station, Zoe handed Amara a secure tablet. "We decrypted more of the files," she said. "There's a reference to something called the cache. It might be a data repository or a physical location where they store sensitive information." Harris frowned. "If we can find it, we might get everything we need to bring them down." "But finding it won't be easy," Zoe added. "It's heavily encrypted, and we're running out of time. The network will know we're onto them." Amara's mind churned with possibilities. "Then we need to split our efforts. One team focuses on cracking the encryption, while the other prepares for the inevitable retaliation." Harris glanced at her, his expression serious. "Are you sure you're up for this? You've already been through hell." Amara's resolve hardened. "I didn't come this far to back down now." As the team dove back into their work, Amara couldn't shake the feeling that the cache held more than just data. It was the key to the network's power, and possibly their greatest weakness. The following day, Amara sat in the dimly lit operations room, her eyes fixed on the flickering lines of code running across the screen. The air was thick with tension as Zoe worked tirelessly to break through the final layers of encryption. Harris paced behind them, his usual calm replaced with a palpable urgency. "We're close," Zoe muttered, her fingers flying over the keyboard. "Just one more layer, and we'll have access to the cache." Amara's mind was racing. This wasn't just another step, this was the step. The cache was rumored to hold every secret the Shadow Network had kept hidden. Locations of trafficking hubs, names of high-ranking officials, and their financial pipelines. If they cracked it, they could dismantle the entire operation. But they also knew the network wouldn't let them get there without a fight. The screen suddenly froze, and Zoe let out a triumphant yell. "We're in!" A list of files and folders appeared, each labeled cryptically. Zoe quickly navigated through them, searching for anything that could provide a clear lead. There, Amara pointed at a folder labeled Vanguard. That name was in one of the earlier files. Zoe opened the folder, revealing a series of video recordings, financial statements, and blueprints. The first video started playing automatically. The grainy footage showed a high-profile gala, attendees dressed in opulent attire. Among them were familiar faces, politicians, corporate leaders, even law enforcement officials. "They're everywhere," Harris said, his voice low. "This isn't just local. This is global." Amara felt a chill run down her spine. One of the guests stood out, a man she hadn't seen before, but whose presence dominated the room. Tall, imposing, and exuding power, he seemed to command attention effortlessly. "Who's that?" Amara asked. Zoe frowned, pulling up another file. "That's Richard Voss, CEO of a multinational tech company, and according to these files, one of the network's top leaders." Amara's stomach churned. "We're not just dealing with criminals. We're dealing with people who control governments and industries." As they continued digging, they found something even more alarming, a document titled Operation Eclipse. "It's a coordinated strike plan," Zoe explained, her voice tense. "They're planning to eliminate key targets, whistleblowers, investigators, even journalists who've gotten too close." Amara's name was on the list. So was Harris. "They're preparing to move fast," Harris said, his jaw tightening. "We need to act now." Amara nodded. "If we expose this publicly, it'll force them into the light. They won't be able to hide anymore." "But that means we'll be their prime targets," Zoe warned. Amara's resolve hardened. "We've been their targets from the start." With the cache decrypted, the team worked quickly to compile the most damning evidence. They'd planned to leak the files to trusted media outlets and international law enforcement agencies simultaneously, ensuring the network couldn't suppress the information. But as they worked, the station's power suddenly flickered, then went out entirely. "What's going on?" Amara asked, her voice laced with panic. Zoe's face was illuminated by the emergency lights as she checked her laptop. "We've been hacked. They're trying to wipe the files remotely." "Can you stop it?" Harris asked. "I'm trying." Zoe replied, her fingers flying over the keyboard. The tension in the room was suffocating. Amara felt helpless, watching as their hard-earned progress teetered on the brink of destruction. Suddenly, the station's alarm blared. Harris grabbed his radio. "What's happening?" A frantic voice crackled through the speaker. "We got intruders, armed men breaching the perimeter." Amara's blood ran cold. The network had found them. The station erupted into chaos as gunfire echoed through the halls. Officers scrambled to defend the building, but the attackers were well coordinated, their precision betraying military-level training. Harris pulled Amara and Zoe into a secure room. "We need to hold them off until reinforcements arrive." Amara nodded, her heart pounding. "What about the files?" "They're still uploading," Zoe said, her voice tight. "But it's slow. If they cut the connection, we'll lose everything." Harris handed Amara a gun. "Can you handle this?" She nodded, her grip firm despite the fear coursing through her veins. "I won't let them win." The sound of footsteps grew louder outside the door. Harris signaled for silence, his weapon raised. The door handle jiggled, and then, with a deafening crash, it burst open. The first intruder entered, his rifle sweeping the room. Harris fired, dropping him instantly. Another followed, and Amara, driven by adrenaline, pulled the trigger. The man fell, his weapon clattering to the floor. Zoe shouted from her station. "The files are at 90%, just a little longer." The attackers didn't relent. More poured in, forcing Harris, Amara, and the few remaining officers to fight desperately. The room was filled with the deafening roar of gunfire and the acrid smell of smoke. Amara's arms ached from the recoil, but she didn't stop. She knew what was at stake. Finally, Zoe let out a triumphant scream. "The upload's complete. The files are live." Relief washed over Amara, but it was short-lived. An explosion rocked the building, sending her sprawling to the ground. The attackers were retreating, but not before setting off charges to cover their escape. "Harris," Amara shouted, coughing through the smoke. "I'm here," he called back, helping her to her feet. "We need to get out." As they stumbled out of the crumbling station, the night air was filled with the wail of sirens and the hum of approaching helicopters. The files were out, and the world would soon know the truth about the Shadow Network. But Amara couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. Richard Voss and his allies wouldn't go down without a fight. And the most dangerous battle was still ahead. The city was in an uproar. News outlets buzzed with the explosive revelations from the leaked cache. Names of high-ranking officials, corporate executives, and law enforcement were plastered across every screen. The Shadow Network was exposed, but instead of retreating into the shadows, they doubled down. Amara sat in the safe house provided by Harris's team, watching the chaos unfold on the news. Richard Voss, the elusive leader of the network, had issued a public statement denying everything. His words dripped with confidence, dismissing the leaks as fabricated. But Amara could see the tension in his eyes. He was cornered, and cornered predators were the most dangerous. "They're calling an emergency summit," Zoe said, bursting into the room with her laptop. "High-level officials are meeting tonight. They'll try to spin this and regain control." Amara clenched her fists. "We can't let them. If they get their story straight, the public will start doubting the evidence." Harris entered, his face grim. "We got intel on the summit location. It's happening at Voss's private estate. Security will be tight, but if we can get in and gather real-time footage, we can expose them once and for all." Amara nodded. "Let's finish this." The team geared up for what would be their most dangerous mission yet. Harris, Zoe, and Amara were joined by a small tactical unit, each member prepared for the high-stakes operation. Voss's estate was a sprawling fortress, nestled in the hills outside the city. High walls, armed guards, and state-of-the-art surveillance systems protected it. But Harris's team had a plan. Under the cover of darkness, they approached the estate. Zoe hacked into the security system, looping the camera feeds to give them a window of opportunity. "We've got 10 minutes before they notice the breach," Zoe whispered. "Let's move." The team scaled the walls and slipped inside, their movements silent and precise. Amara's heart pounded as they navigated the maze-like corridors, avoiding guards and surveillance drones. Finally, they reached the main conference room. Through the glass walls, they could see Voss and his associates, their faces tense as they argued. Amara set up a small camera, streaming the meeting live to multiple news outlets. "Let's see how they explain this," she muttered. The team watched as Voss stood, his commanding presence silencing the room. "Gentlemen," he began, his voice calm but firm, "we've survived worse. The public is fickle. With the right narrative, we can turn this in our favor." Amara felt a surge of anger. This man, with his calculated words and cold demeanor, was responsible for so much suffering. Suddenly, an alarm blared. The guards had discovered the breach. "They know we're here," Harris shouted. "We need to move." But before they could retreat, Voss's men stormed the room. A firefight erupted, bullets ricocheting off the walls. Amara and the team took cover, returning fire as they fought to escape. Amara spotted Voss slipping out through a side door. "He's getting away," she yelled. "I'll cover you," Harris shouted. "Go." Amara sprinted after Voss, her determination outweighing her fear. She chased him through the estate's labyrinthine halls, finally cornering him in a grand library. "It's over, Voss," she said, her gun trained on him. Voss raised his hands, a smirk on his face. "Is it, though? You may have exposed us, but you'll never stop the network. We're everywhere." Amara's grip tightened. "We'll see about that." Before Voss could respond, the sound of approaching footsteps echoed through the hall. His reinforcements were coming. Amara knew she had seconds to act. She grabbed a nearby chair and wedged it under the door handle, buying herself time. "You're not walking out of here," she said, pulling out a flash drive. "This is everything the public needs to finish you." Voss's smirk faltered. "You won't make it out alive." Amara backed toward a window, keeping her gun trained on him. "Maybe not, but neither will your empire." With that, she fired at the window, shattering the glass. The sound of the explosion startled Voss, just enough for Amara to make her move. She leaped through the broken window, landing hard on the lawn below. As she hit the ground, the tactical team arrived, providing cover fire as they extracted her. The live stream from the summit, combined with the data on the flash drive, spread like wildfire across the globe. By dawn, governments were launching investigations, arrests were being made, and the shadow network was crumbling. Amara sat in the back of a rescue vehicle, her body bruised but her spirit unbroken. Harris sat beside her, a rare smile on his face. "You did it," he said. "No," Amara replied, her gaze distant. "We did it." In the weeks that followed, Amara became a symbol of resilience and courage. She was hailed as a hero, but she knew the fight wasn't over. The Shadow Network had lost its leaders, but remnants still lurked in the shadows. As she stood before a crowd at a press conference, Amara made a vow. "We've taken down a dangerous organization, but the battle for justice continues. Together we will ensure that those who exploit and harm others are brought to light." The crowd erupted in applause, but Amara knew her journey was far from complete. The Shadow Network may have fallen, but new threats would always rise, and she was ready for them.